You're listening to a podcast from thespoilist.com. Welcome to First Contact, the ultimate guide to Star Trek, The Next Generation. I'm Andrew.
I'm James.
And I'm Alex.
This time we have been watching Hollow Pursuits. It was written by Sally Caves and directed by Cliff Bole. It first aired the week of April 30th, 1990. James, what is this one all about?
What do you do when you get a relatively high-profile guest star? You attempt to build a fun episode around them, of course. Dwight Schultz stars as Reg Broccoli. Oh, should I say Reg Barclay? A nervous man who is all of us and helps the audience understand that the entire senior staff of the Enterprise are dicks, especially Wesley. He has social anxiety and uses the holodeck as therapy, recreating fanciful versions of the crew to work out his problems and enact his fantasies. But when it starts to interfere with his job, both Geordi and Riker decide it's time to take action and try and get him off the ship. But when a weird thing the writers never bothered to properly define starts happening, which could destroy the ship, Reg steps up to the plate. But can he save the day? Yeah, kinda.
Well, for the second episode running, we have got a show built around a guest star. Alex, did you think this one worked?
Well, I suppose normally this intro is just the time when I would take the piss out of the episode. But it's a comedic episode, and I'm going to go in exactly the opposite route and be incredibly sincere instead and say I thought this was a very good episode. I would happily see this one again.
You know, I actually did think before I rewatched it, my vague memory of it was that it's a fun episode. I've always thought of it as, you know, one of those episodes that does comedy quite right. You know, it's got that funny nickname and, you know, those funny holodeck recreations. And I had such a horrible feeling all the way through it. A lot of the main crew proved themselves to be bullies, basically. And it's in many ways it seemed ahead of its time in that a lot of people bully people in this way now. You know, we've got TV shows like The Big Bang Theory, which take the piss out of nerds and basically normalise bullying them. And I was left with a horrible, horrible feeling after watching this. I didn't laugh, except for the last line, which admittedly is very good. And as I tweeted to both of you guys, Wesley is a prick, and I felt so bad after watching this episode. I wasn't happy. I didn't have that fuzzy feeling after a really well done comedy Star Trek episode.
I think the interesting thing here is that I think this shows how much the show lacks in some ways in terms of character. Because here we have someone, I think, that we can identify with. Whereas you have all the rest of the characters and they're basically superheroes. And you've seen what you have to go through to get into Starfleet Academy, and you know, you have to do the psychological testing and you have to do all the science and you have to stand at a station and help people and do everything quickly. And then you have this character who perhaps unrealistically would have got through all that, and they comment on that in the episode, but it's someone you're sort of like, yeah, when he says that line about being in a room full of people and trying to look natural talking to a potted plant, my wife said, "Oh, that's you in a party." And yeah, but I think a lot of people who like this sort of thing could easily identify with this kind of character, someone who's not the most comfortable in social situations, someone who doesn't know the right thing to say, who maybe needs to take a little bit of time to compose themselves before actually speaking, and feels that everyone else isn't giving them a chance.
What I would preface that with is that wasn't the intention of the writers. It wasn't supposed to be a representation of, you know, Star Trek fans, basically. It was really identifying with the writers of the show.
And I can see how that plays into it, though, because I think a lot of the writers would possibly see themselves in these terms. Somewhat introverted, but able to create these great worlds and these confident characters and these different situations through their art. And it's not necessarily fan identification. If you think of that in the same way that Gene Roddenberry put Wesley Crusher on the ship to represent him, someone who could do everything and be everything, and even at the age of 15 could save the ship. I think that possibly tells you a lot about the different sensibilities and the egos of say Gene Roddenberry and Michael Piller who worked on rewrites of this episode.
I think as well, I can see what you mean about sort of, oh look, he's a massive nerd, but I think it's kind of hard actually to relate to a lot of the characters in TNG, because okay, it's been downplayed from that sort of Roddenberry, oh everyone's superhuman and no one has arguments and everyone's great and none of this sounds a bit Aryan, but I find them kind of cold. And you're right, I think Wesley is a prick, and he is difficult to relate to, and I think Geordie's kind of detached. And you'll have flashes with people, but I don't ever get a lingering sense of, well, I can relate to that character. Whereas Barclay is obviously set up as someone for you to relate to, and they may make fun of that character, but I think a lot of the elements in it are actually kind of truthful. That way that he doesn't want to say something to their faces, but he'll quite happily mock them in private by making a simulation of them. I can get that. Yeah, I can latch onto it, and actually it kind of brings down the pomposity of some of the other characters.
Yes, there is some nice stuff, I think, with the characters. I think the segment with Picard, where both Geordi and Riker go to complain about him and say, look, he's not the guy we were promised. I try to get on with everyone. I can't. And Picard's basically says, well, get on with him. Make him your friend. Try and find out more about him. And I think Picard comes off very well in that situation. Riker in this episode is basically the angry boss. And he's just like, Barclay! But I think Geordi certainly comes off very badly in this episode. I like James, find the whole engineering section very uncomfortable. This is a name we've come up with, and it's just pure cruelty. Like, we call him Broccoli, and it has a nice joke with Picard saying it by accident, and then you get some nice character stuff from Brent Spiner there, commenting on it in that Data way, and Patrick Stewart's horrified face. That is nice, but I do think that Geordi is pretty horrendous in this episode, and especially Wesley is just, I know this, I'm going to act all superior. Have you tried doing it this way? And I think we've all been in situations like that, where someone is just telling you how to do something that you know how to do, and I bet Wesley would be a real mansplainer on Twitter, wouldn't he? Well, actually, this is what this is about.
I would agree that they are engaged in some outright bullying. However, and I don't think this is intentional, but again, I kind of take some amusement in the fact that the name they've come up with for him is Mr. Broccoli. Because that's just such a half-assed mocking of someone's name. Barclay, Broccoli, what? I mean, even later on, Data will try and justify it, saying, well, it's actually very easy to confuse the phrase Brock with Bark. No, it bloody isn't. What the hell are you on about? They're not even vaguely similar. And so I kind of, again, as a way of pricking pomposity, and I don't think it's necessarily meant to be interpreted that way, but I was watching it thinking, yeah, they can't even come up with a vaguely amusing nickname for him. All they've come up with is something that's crap.
That's how pathetic their bullying is. They can't even come up with a good, helpful nickname.
Let's get to the plot a bit. So it's a holodeck episode in some ways. Incidentally, a holodeck episode without any character realising that they're a holodeck character and gaining some sentience. Using it as essentially a form of entertainment.
The holodeck characters have become real.
And they want to take control of the Enterprise. Holodeck Captain Picard thinks he's superior because he's tied right into the computer. No. So that's not happening. It's a piece of entertainment. Someone is using it to escape from the real world, which, of course you would. That's sort of why it's there. And there's some interesting stuff that arises from that, which we'll get onto. But that opening scene is just good fun. We do not know this character at all, but this scene tells you everything that you need to know. They do the stranger in the saloon in a Western in 10 Forward. It's so much fun, and it's ridiculous, and it uses all the cliches. And Dwight Schultz just has this innate likability, this comic performance, but this sympathetic loser, and it just works from that moment. I think you think, yep, I am on board with this episode. I get what they are trying to do, and when it's disturbed by reality, yeah, it tells you everything that you need to know.
Was the character written for him? It just would not work with any other actor.
I think he'd worked with Whoopi Goldberg and told her he was a big Star Trek fan. And so he had asked if the right part came along, if he could maybe get a role. So I think it was written specifically for him. And I think we talked in the last episode about a guest star kind of taking over. And this time, this is so much a guest star episode. This belongs to Barclay. It's about him, it's about his motivations, it's about his feelings, it's about ultimately his successes. He's a character who goes through an arc. He changes in the episode. And actually, you would argue, he actually has had more to do than some of the regular characters have. In this one episode, he displays more growth than a lot of the regulars have throughout the entire run of this series.
And as a byproduct of his story as well, we actually get a new way of viewing some of those main characters as well. Because they're not being focused as the lead or literally just set dressing at times, let's be honest. Some of those people on the bridge, very little to do sometimes. And especially, as you said before, with Riker, it gives us a chance to see the other side of the coin in a way.
And I think it does give a very interesting view of the ship, in that the captain is such a figurehead that nobody has any dealing with the captain, really, other than our regular characters, the senior staff. Everything goes through Riker, essentially, who is in charge, and the captain gets involved in all the important stuff. Whereas the running of the ship is done by the department heads and by Riker, and only they can go to Picard, and Picard essentially tells them, not my problem, you deal with this. And yeah, lots of insight. And I think Troy, in this episode, again, I think it's quite a fun use of Troy in here. We can talk about the kind of the rights and wrongs of the holodeck stuff later, but actual Troy giving a counselling session to a crew member, and then acting extremely smug and taking the piss on the holodeck a bit, and then made the butt of a joke later on. So yeah, like, it's nice to see her kind of just being
a real person.
A real person, yeah, not sensing things or saying the aliens are so anguished, just being a character and doing a job.
Well, it kind of goes back to what you said about how a lot of these characters haven't had any development at all, and Troy is one of them. A lot of things have happened to her. She's had a child, and okay, an alien child, but it's changed nothing about who she is.
They mentioned it once.
I stand corrected. And even worse, Beverly Crusher, absolutely zero development at all. She was not even in one season, and actually, she's only in this episode as a hologram.
Actually, in recent times, they've completely ignored Wesley as well. as a character who was so much the focus in a lot of the early episodes. He's just guy who is there. Yeah, he's literally sort of a crewman who sits and presses buttons and doesn't really have an awful lot to do.
They should just write him out, shouldn't they? Maybe in about 15 episodes time or something like that.
If I were him as an actor, I would start to get a bit frustrated around this point. Perhaps make some decisions about my movie career, which was taking off at the time, which worked out brilliantly, of course. Let's talk a bit about the holodeck stuff. Now, it's stated in this episode, there's no regulation against recreating people from the real world, and I can understand that for, simulations or something like that, if you want to run drills in the holodeck or anything like that. But there are definitely ethical and moral implications about recreating stuff in the holodeck. Now, at this stage, it's not really mentioned. It's reasonably wholesome. Nobody's saying that people use the holodeck for sex.
Well,
they do though.
The goddess of empathy, it's
yeah, it's a bit.
You can read between the lines there, I think.
And it's been heavily implied in the past that Riker uses the holodeck for sex.
No, I think you've implied that in the past.
And Geordi got his rocks off in the holodeck,
which is mentioned.
I fell in love in there.
You should have seen the cleanup. It doesn't wash away with everything else, I can tell you that. 2 buckets of foamy water.
I think the thing is, it's your own kind of personal, private fantasy. It's a computer helping you draw somebody and then that drawing coming to life. But that's what it is, personal, private. And they're just walking in on it. That's the really bad part about it.
It is personal and private, and therefore, why are there no locks on the door?
I think there are locks, it's just they're the senior officers, so they can open up any door they like.
I prepare for the nerdiest statement ever on the podcast, but I'd like to know more about the scheduling and the time sharing of use of the holodeck.
Well, you'll want to watch Voyager then.
Because it seems that he's in there quite a lot when the whole of the crew have access to it, and there's not a lot else going on entertainment-wise on the ship. I mean, if he is able to literally fall asleep in the holodeck and not have someone outside dressed up as a musketeer pissed off that they can't get their slot, I have my questions.
Riker at the door pissed off he can't get a slot. I think Geordi getting all high and mighty about, this guy's doing this in the holodeck, what a sicko, is absurd, because obviously he is absolutely more flawed. He's fallen in love with an instructional manual, essentially.
Well, we've all gotten a bit giddy over a Haynes manual.
It could very easily have gone the other way with Reg in this, and I feel I can call him Reg because I feel we've bonded. Because it would be very easy not to be sympathetic with him here, because I think it is there's definitely something off about doing this, about recreating people and it's okay to kind of fight Riker and sort of get your tension out on him, maybe. Getting the girl and kissing her, there's then, I think we get into some very problematic ground there.
Which, to be fair, they later acknowledge in Deep Space Nine quite well.
In Deep Space Nine, they've got people paying to want recreations of other people, and there it is. Essentially, the holo suites are brothels, basically. But here, it's sort of innocently done, and you've got that with all the imagery of the musketeers and the blue boy and all that kind of thing. It's all very twee.
That's the thing, isn't it? We're very smutty-minded people, and we think read between the lines of Troi being the goddess of empathy, But really, I mean, their intention in writing it may have just been for this to be a silly little fantasy world. He wasn't having sex on the holodeck with Troi. It was just an innocent bit of silly fantasy.
Which then raises the other sort of moral problems, as you were saying, people just bursting in on your fantasies, like people coming in, opening doors, essentially seeing into your psyche.
It's reading somebody's diary.
It doesn't seem like they've got a lot of respect, and I guess the answer is Barclay isn't really doing his job, and that started to impact on his real life, and therefore they think as superior officers they've got the right to do that. But even as the ship is headed for destruction, they don't turn it off because they're so curious to see. They're so desperate to see what comes next and laugh at it and point.
Well, you can't switch off the program because it'll destroy his fantasy and it'll rip him from it. You can't do that. What you've got to do is you've got to humiliate him completely. It's going on stage and reading somebody's fan fiction, getting Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman to read slash fiction on stage. It's that, isn't it?
May I remind you of our Shades of Grey podcast?
I wrote that slash fiction myself, I tell you. It's not really addressed in the episode because the episode is kind of having fun.
And that's what I mean by it's ahead of its time, really. It's issues that have really only appeared after this, with the advent of the internet. The nerd culture hasn't really been established until much later. And, it is only... And I watched The Big Bang Theory when it started. I watched the first few seasons, and I took it rather innocently as a silly bit of fun. And now I really hate the show because it is bullying. They're forcing Sheldon Cooper, who is really a very innocent person who just is a bit, different, but he's not harming anybody. But he must be normal. And this has shades of that.
In some ways, there's this conformity on the Enterprise, and we want everyone to be just like us. We want them to work like us, to think like us, essentially. Everyone must be this way. And I guess it's a pseudo-military organisation. In some ways, it's got that chain of command, so that's understandable. But there's a real problem of difference here, and that's troubling, isn't it? And I suppose it's kind of resolved at the end. Well, we've got a new respect for Reg, because he sort of worked as a group, which saved the day in the science fiction plot. Do you want to talk about the science fiction plot?
What, the plot of, hey, this canister's got a crack in it? Well, leave it. It's probably not a massive plot device that'll come back at the end. Okay.
This element, which is around the ship, which is causing various things to happen, like glass to melt and the transporter to malfunction and the engines to seize up. Yeah, it's creating a problem to be solved, which is apparently very easily solved. And it's, well, the transporter doesn't detect certain elements and they can't be sensed by the ship either. And then we've got to run through a list and then say, yeah, that's it. And then it'll be fine.
The whole ship is contaminated, Captain. But, if we just flood the engines, it'll be fine. I'm sure none of the rest of it that's spread throughout the ship and could move has been proven throughout the rest of the episode, that just one person who's picked some up and moving around could actually just recontaminate everything.
It is incidental, and I'm okay with it. It just is very signposted. It's very much, this isn't working, oh, this is cracked, and it's everywhere. And I still don't really understand exactly what it is or how it happened or how it worked.
Excuse me, Mr. LaForge, I don't think you've noticed this plot device. Would you like me to move the plot device? I'll just leave it here. It's just propping the door open.
I think the other thing is we've got Guinan here, who is wearing a Satsuma, as far as I can tell. She's interestingly used, and basically Geordi says, I can't work with this guy, he's not like me. And she says, stop being horrible. There's more than one type of person. You know, she gets to tell a long, rambling story, and Whoopi Goldberg does that well because she's charismatic. And I think it does very much show that the writer's sympathies are with Barclay, although the crew of the Enterprise are apparently against him.
I really like Guinan and Picard. Yeah, they are, you know, a lot of the times maybe there's not a right and wrong point of view, but I think they're the right point of view here. They're showing compassion and, you know, patience, whereas I thought that the worst scene was Geordi invites Reg to this meeting, and everybody's just so impatient with him. When they realise that he's stuttering and he's struggling to get out his words, but he is getting them out, and they're just talking over him, and they're being so impatient. And a lot of people have a lot of trouble talking in front of people. I've spent half of today writing this big long guide. Tomorrow morning I'm going to have to stand up in front of the entire team and explain this guide to them all. It's going to be really annoying. It's going to be really difficult, and I'm quite good at speaking in front of people. For somebody who struggles like that, you know, the number one fear people have is talking in front of people. That's above death. Why aren't they nicer? They're meant to be the perfect people from the future. Why don't they have any sympathy whatsoever? Any understanding?
Because they're all horrible, self-obsessed pricks.
But isn't that interesting? Like, how often have we said that? Gene Roddenberry's box. You've got these perfect humans, and suddenly we actually have a real human, a real person. And you sort of wonder, well, why is that allowed? How come we get to actually have someone with flaws in here? Because this does not fit the mold of humanity in Star Trek Next Generation. Look how much more interesting it is. Look how it brings out the worst aspects of other characters, showing how flawed and terrible people actually are, even in the future. People can't have meetings without being just horrendous to each other.
I'm sure it's the words of a heathen to say it, but Roddenberry's view of what the show should have been had a lasting impact that has reached through even into this season and had a bit of an impact in a negative way. And when you should have crafted from the outset characters with a loose template, basically what they are now, and then developed on that, it just all seemed to go right. And it may be misplaced, but I can only assume it's because the genesis of the show was more interested in the concept than it was in its characters.
They certainly never developed the same warmth as you would say they did in the original series, or the same dynamic. And there's an attempt at that in the movies, sort of bigging up certain characters, and not entirely successfully.
In all honesty, a lot of the way that you develop that, a lot of the time, is to have people talk to each other, to relate their views, to relate their past experiences. It's one of the reasons that Red Dwarf finds its footing fairly soon. You've got your two leads quite regularly just sat in bunks discussing their worldview and their experiences that made them who they are. In TNG up to this point, quite a lot of the time when people have been talking to each other, most of the time they're talking about the plot rather than about their feelings.
Well, Troy talks about feelings a lot.
It doesn't help to develop things other than the plot. And that is tangential in a way to the series because the plot finishes at the end of the episode and is gone.
Do we really want to hear about Riker's feelings?
Barclay is going to become a recurring character in other episodes and, you know, remains quite an interesting presence. And you'll have other characters who become recurring later on who shake things up a bit. And it just makes me wonder why they never introduced another series regular. Why they didn't actually bring in their own characters to make things interesting, or even swap people out. It seems like the show could be massively improved by bringing in a bit more humanity.
what we needed was Argyle.
The show has brought in some humanity here. It's just not with our main leads. It's strange in that sense that we've got the humanity, and it's helping us to realise how removed our leads are in some senses. But in a way, that's good. That helps you to go forward and correct your course.
They do it a little bit with Miles O'Brien. He gets a fair bit more material, and he's more out the norm than the main TNG regulars.
I was stunned when he turned up in this episode. They paid Col Meany an appearance fee for that. Extraordinary.
But I think we've just found out what the Transporter Chief does all day. He basically beams a bucket from one pad to the other, waiting for someone who will eventually want to transport down to a planet. He just stands there with his bucket, moving it. Pad 1. Pad 2. Pad 3. Pad 4. Pad 5. Pad 6. Pad 1. Oh my god, it's broken! What's wrong with it?
Well, he's currently performing at the theatre in the street next to my work, so I shall go to the stage door and question him on that daily. Calm, loved you in Cat in a Hot Tin Roof, but could you elaborate? This bucket issue.
I will acknowledge here that, I'm taking this episode very seriously. And, it's a bit harsh on me, really, that we've had episodes that have dealt with terrorism, and I've been all very blasé about them. But we have an episode which deals with people with social anxiety and maybe touches on nerds, and I'm very furious about it. I take it very seriously. This is supposed to be a fun episode. I was expecting us to just be so silly, this podcast. We'd just take the rip out of everything. We'd have so much fun. But it's just, after I finished the episode, I was so sad. Except it did end on a laugh, which I appreciated.
I think we've said all we can about that, really, and I certainly enjoyed it. So let's go to Quickfire and see if we've got anything else to say.
Quickfire.
Barclay, as mentioned, was recurring on the TV show. He would go on to appear in one TNG film, which was First Contact. He was also written into Insurrection, but executives pointed out to the writers that Geordi didn't have anything to do, so all Barclay stuff was given to Geordi eventually. Which tells you everything you need to know.
Barclay refers to the flux capacitor when in Troy's office, which is apparently a reference to the Back to the Future series, though I imagine that was not in the script.
I think I have read this somewhere, that he says the wrong word. He's meant to say flow capacitor.
And then they cut out that further line of, so why don't you make like a tree and bark, Lee?
Hollow Wesley's appearance was based on the famous Thomas Gainsborough painting, The Blue Boy, and the costume was copied in detail. And I feel we can agree that was really worth it for the costume designer. Spending the hours meticulously crafting that costume just to perfectly replicate Gainsborough's famous work.
Yeah, and it's a good thing they went for something so populous that is, obviously so instantly recognisable. I feel without it, the joke would have been somewhat lost.
And it wasn't actually in the script to have Wesley eating the pies, but sound effect said that Jim Wolvington had just ordered so many in order to record his stomach digesting the pies that they had to use it on screen.
Jim, I've been going through your expenses. This is getting ludicrous. I gotta have the pies.
If you don't know who Dwight Schultz is, he's best known for 80s action series The A-Team as Captain Howling Mad Murdoch, which is obviously a very politically correct thing to do. And his hairline will move significantly throughout his appearances on Star Trek.
In the future, they still haven't solved hair loss.
So, being a relatively good episode, I did wonder what trivialities the Nitpicker's Guide could choose to give to us this time. And rather depressingly, the main thrust of their argument seems to be that the rest of the crew just enter the holodeck willy-nilly, which is the same point that we raised some time ago in this podcast, meaning that we have now reached the point where we are making the points from this book unaided.
A stopwatch is right twice a day.
I mean, we've not even got round to writing a book, so in many ways they're better than us. Although, to be fair, I must have spent several hundred hours editing this podcast. So, you know, happy times. Well, that was another episode, and we enjoyed this one, so that was good. Next time we'll be back talking about the most toys. Yeah, we will. But for now, goodbye.
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 If I died, this would be my legacy, and that makes me quite sad.
We'll buy you a gravestone that says something relevant.
He didn't live long, but he did prosper.
You have been witnessing the life of a man from thespoilist.com.
Yeah.
He died in an unfortunate blaze. It was a quick fire.
Boom.
Review this grave on iTunes.
And nobody will. Nobody will leave a review on iTunes, will they?
So, someone just comes up with a can of spray paint and sprays over the gravestone. Too politically correct.
1 star. Well, I certainly enjoy the content of his death, but the frequency just wasn't enough for my liking.